My daughter, Amelia, just sealed her fate with a single, almost graceful tilt of a wine bottle. And the only thing I felt was cold, a profound, crystalline cold that had nothing to do with the ridiculously overchilled air in Aurelia, Boston's latest temple of gastronomic pretense. We were on display, the three of us like insects pinned to velvet. Two cameras, their red lights, glowing like malevolent eyes, captured our little family drama for season 3 of a reality show called Legacy Unlocked. A vulgar title for a vulgar program, but Amelia had insisted. It was, she'd said, essential for the brand she and her fiancé were building. Her fiancé, Julian Vance. He sat opposite me, a portrait of manufactured success. A Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than my first car, a Patek Philippe on his wrist, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. His eyes were the color of a shark's belly, and they were fixed on me, waiting. Amelia leaned forward, the camera zooming in to capture the intimate moment between father and daughter. She was beautiful, my daughter. She had her mother's eyes, a deep, expressive hazel that could convey a universe of emotion. Right now, they were conveying a carefully rehearsed blend of affection and concern. A special occasion calls for a special wine, Daddy, she murmured, her voice a silken performance for the microphones hidden in the floral centerpiece. She was pouring from a bottle of 1982 Chateau Margaux, a bottle from my cellar, a bottle I'd been saving for her 30th birthday. I watched the dark crimson liquid arc into my glass, and I saw it. You spend 40 years of your life as a restorer of rare books and manuscripts. You learn to see things others don't. You see the subtle watermark on a page of a Gutenberg Bible. You see the faint trace of a palimpsest beneath a medieval monk's prayer. Your entire world is built on noticing the microscopic flaw, the infinitesimal deviation from norm. The wine was wrong. It wasn't something a normal person would ever notice. But as the liquid swirled, its legs, the rivulets that cling to the glass, moved a fraction of a second too slowly. There was a faint, almost imperceptible viscosity to it, a subtle sheening under the restaurant's artfully directed spotlights that spoke of a foreign agent suspended within. A colorless, odorless compound, soluble, but not perfectly so. I lifted my eyes from the glass and looked at my daughter. Her hand, the one holding the bottle, had the slightest tremor. Her smile was a beautiful, brittle thing, stretched taut over a bedrock of sheer terror. Beside her, Julian gave a nearly invisible nod, a flicker of confirmation. The predator, pleased with his trained hunting dog. They thought I was just an old man, a dusty academic who spent his days breathing the scent of decaying paper and leather-binding glue. They saw Arthur Finch, the quiet widower who lived in a Beacon Hill brownstone, a relic from a bygone era. They saw a walking trust fund, a library of assets waiting to be liquidated. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They had no concept of the man my late wife, Eleanor, had simply called the librarian. A long time ago, my library wasn't filled with books. It was filled with ledgers, not of accounts, but of sins, of secrets, of leverage points capable of toppling governments and gutting Fortune 500 companies. I didn't work for the CIA or the NSA. I worked for a much higher, much more private authority, Equilibrium. I was the man they called when the scales of power tipped too far into the hands of the corrupt. And my job was to tip them back, quietly and irrevocably. I retired the day Eleanor died. I packed away my ledgers and promised her I would raise our daughter in a world of peace, a world without shadows. I had failed. The shadows had found their way into my home, and they were sitting right across the table from me. A hot surge of rage, white and pure, threatened to boil over. The urge to flip the table, to grab Julian by his silk tie, and show him what true fear felt like, was a physical force. But the librarian had never been a man of action. He was a man of consequences. He didn't stop the axe from falling. He simply ensured it fell on the right neck. And so, I did what he would have done. I smiled. A slow, warm, paternal smile that I knew the cameras would interpret as pride. I looked at Amelia, my beautiful, broken daughter. Then I looked at the parasite who had broken her. To the future, I said, my voice perfectly level. I raised a tainted glass. To your new brand. May it bring you everything you deserve. Julian's smile widened. Amelia's wavered. A flicker of something? Guilt? Fear? Crossing her face before she mastered it. They raised their glasses to mine. The clinking sound was obscene in its finality. I brought the rim to my lips. I let a single drop touch my tongue. The familiar notes of blackcurrant and cedarwood, now laced with a faint, bitter, chemical tang that confirmed my analysis. Then, I lowered the glass, setting it down without drinking. Before they could register the change, I reached across the small table, my movements fluid and unhurried. I picked up the small, untouched plate of artisanal bread that sat directly in front of Julian. You know, I said, my voice conversational. The doctor said I need to cut back on my carbs. You're young. You can handle it. And with that simple, innocuous movement, I swapped my bread plate with his. It wasn't the wine. The wine was just the overture. Julian's eyes widened for a fraction of a second. He looked at the plate, then at me. Confusion warred with alarm on his perfectly composed face. Amelia froze, her wine glass halfway to her lips. They'd made a classic amateur's mistake. They'd assumed the target would be focused on the obvious threat, the drug drink. But the librarian was never caught looking where they wanted him to look. On my plate, nestled beside the olive tapenade, was a single, perfectly crafted pat of butter, stamped with the restaurant's logo. It was identical to the one on his plate. Almost. Mine, I knew from the subtle scent of almonds it gave off, a scent no one else would detect, was laced with something far more interesting than a sedative. Something that wouldn't show up on a standard toxicology screen. A bespoke neurocognitive agent developed in a private Swiss lab decades ago. It wouldn't hurt him. Not physically. It would simply, for the next 48 hours, make him utterly and completely incapable of lying. A human truth serum, delivered via unsalted butter. The cameras were still rolling. The finale of their show was set to be a live interview in 2 days, where they would tearfully announce my sudden cognitive decline and their noble decision to take over my affairs. They wanted a story for their reality show. I just changed the ending. I picked up my water glass, took a long, slow sip, and looked directly into the lens of the nearest camera. Let the show begin. The morning after the dinner at Aurelia, my world was exactly as I had left it. The sun cast long, dusty shafts of light through the tall windows of my workshop, illuminating the silent, waiting patients on my benches. A 15th century book of hours, its vellum pages brittle as autumn leaves. A first edition of Moby Dick, its spine ravaged by time and a careless reader. A collection of letters from a Civil War soldier to his wife. The ink faded to a ghostly brown. This was my sanctuary, a place built on patience and precision. The air smelled of history, of aged paper, tanned leather, linseed oil, and the subtle, clean scent of my own proprietary bookbinding paste. Every tool on the wall had its purpose, its place. Bone folders polished smooth by decades of use. Scalpels honed to a surgeon's sharpness. An array of lying presses and plows that looked like instruments of medieval torture, but were, in fact, instruments of healing. This was the life I had built for Amelia after Eleanor was gone. A life of quiet order, of tangible beauty, of things that lasted. I wanted to give her a world without sharp edges, a world where the only battles were against the slow, inevitable decay of time. I thought that if I surrounded her with enough history, enough substance, she would absorb its lessons. That she would learn that true value is not loud, but quiet, not new, but enduring. A fool's hope, it turned out. A father's foolish, loving hope. I first met Julian Vance 6 months ago. He didn't walk into my home. He breezed in, an arctic gust of ambition and cologne that seemed to curdle the warm, book-scented air. He wore a suit so sharp it looked like it could draw blood, and his handshake was a brief, firm act of assessment, not greeting. He surveyed my library, the one place in the house that was more me than even my workshop. His eyes, those pale, calculating eyes, didn't see the stories on the shelves. They didn't see the signed Hemingway, the crumbling folio of Shakespeare, the leather-bound volumes of philosophy I had collected over a lifetime. They saw assets. They scanned a room like a barcode reader, calculating, appraising, liquidating. Incredible, he'd said, his voice smooth as polished marble. The potential here is untapped. We could digitize the most valuable pieces, create an NFT collection. The Finch collection. It has a ring to it. I remember looking at Amelia, expecting to see a shared moment of amused disbelief. Instead, I saw a rapturous gleam in her eyes. She was mesmerized. He spoke a language she had been desperate to learn, a language of disruption and monetization, of scaling and leveraging. A language that had no words for beauty or history or love. That was the first shadow. They grew longer and darker in the months that followed. Amelia, who had once loved to sit with me while I worked, now found the workshop stuffy. My stories about the provenance of a particular manuscript, which used to fascinate her, were now met with polite, vacant smiles and a quick glance at her phone. Her vocabulary changed. It became infested with his buzzwords. Everything was about optics, narrative, and personal branding. She started referring to our family legacy not as a history to be proud of, but as seed capital. Julian was a virus in the source code of her life, rewriting her core programming. And I let it happen. I watched, I listened, and I said nothing. Because a part of me, the father, believed she had to find her own way. The other part of me, the librarian, knew that you never confront a threat until you understand its nature, its scope, and its every vulnerability. The real alarm bell rang 3 weeks ago. It was a Tuesday. I remember because I was restitching the binding of a rare copy of Dante's Inferno. Julian and Amelia were in the kitchen, their voices low, believing I was lost in my work. My hearing is as sharp as my scalpel's. It's just sitting there, dormant, Julian was saying, his voice a low, persuasive hum. The trust is an archaic structure. If we could just get signatory power, I could move it into a high-yield fund. We're talking an 8-figure return in the first year, Amy. He'll never agree, Amelia had whispered. He doesn't trust anyone with money. Not since. He's old. Julian cut in, his voice suddenly hard, stripped of its usual charm. He's losing a step. People his age, their faculties start to decline. It's a medical issue, not a personal one. The responsible thing, the loving thing to do, would be to protect him from his own confusion. Confusion. I set down my needle. My hands were perfectly steady. In that moment, I saw the entire blueprint of their plan laid out before me, like the pages of a book. It wasn't a simple smash and grab for money. It was more insidious. They were going to erase me. Not my body, but my mind. They were going to paint me as a doddering old fool, a man who could no longer be trusted with his own legacy. They were going to use my love for her as the very weapon to destroy me. I finished the stitch on Dante's Inferno, the needle moving with the same precise, unhurried rhythm as always. But inside, the cold had returned. The crystalline, functional cold of the librarian. The quiet restorer was gone. My library was no longer just a collection of books. It was an arsenal, and I was about to select my weapon. That night, I picked up my phone. I scrolled through a list of contacts filled with names Amelia would never recognize. Auction house curators, university deans, rare book dealers. And then one name, buried among the others, listed simply as M. Thorne Security. Marcus Thorne. We hadn't spoken in 15 years. The last time I saw him, he was a young, hungry NSA analyst with more talent than sense. I had saved his career, and possibly his life, from a disastrous entanglement in Brussels involving a rogue oligarch and some stolen banking codes. He owed me, not a favor, a debt. Debts, unlike promises, are always honored. I dialed the number. He answered on the second ring. "This is a legacy number," he said, his voice deeper now, more cautious. "No greeting." He knew who it had to be. "The librarian is checking out a book," I said, using the old code. "Julian Vance. Silicon Valley. I want the unabridged edition. Every page. Every footnote." There was a pause. Then a soft exhale. "Consider it read," Marcus said. "I'll send you the summary." The line went dead. I looked out the window at the quiet, gaslit streets of Beacon Hill. The game had begun. They thought it was their game, played by their rules. They were about to learn that when you step into a library, you play by the librarian's rules. And the first rule is silence. The second is that every debt is recorded, and every book eventually must be returned. The request I made of Julian wasn't a request. It was a diagnostic test. A week after my call to Marcus, I found Julian alone in the study, admiring a framed map of 17th century Boston that hung over the fireplace. He was holding a glass of my best single malt scotch, the kind of casual appropriation he perfected. I leaned against the doorframe, projecting an air of weary thoughtfulness. "Julian," I began, my voice mild. "I've been thinking about what you said, about modernizing the portfolio." His eyes lit up, the predatory gleam barely concealed. He turned, giving me his full attention. "Arthur, I am glad. There's so much potential we could unlock." "Perhaps," I said, walking over to my desk. "I'm an old man, set in my ways. This world of venture capital and crypto, it's a foreign language to me. But I trust Amelia, and she trusts you." I let that hang in the air for a moment. "Hypothetically, if I were to consider allowing you to manage a portion of the family trust, what would that look like?" He launched into his pitch. It was slick, well-rehearsed, full of jargon designed to simultaneously impress and obfuscate. Synergy, disruption, algorithmic trading. He talked for 10 minutes, a torrent of confident nonsense. I listened, nodding occasionally, my expression one of gentle, slightly confused interest. I was playing the part they had already cast for me, the aging patriarch, ripe for the plucking. "It sounds complex," I said when he finally paused for breath. "It's the future, Arthur," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder in a gesture of feigned intimacy. "Let me draw up a proposal. I'll just need temporary access to the main accounts to assess the liquidity and current asset allocation. A standard exploratory measure." There it was, the probe. The first attempt to breach the firewall. "No," I said, softly but with an edge of finality that cut through his smooth facade. "Not yet. I need to think. This is my wife's legacy, my daughter's future. I can't rush it." His smile tightened by a millimeter. "Of course. Take all the time you need." But his eyes told a different story. They were cold with impatience. The test was complete. He had confirmed his target's resistance and would now move to circumvent it. From that day on, the house began to feel different. It was a subtle shift, the kind of change only a man accustomed to noticing the fading of ink on a 500-year-old page would perceive. A book on my nightstand was moved a quarter of an inch to the left. The chair at my desk, which I always pushed in completely, was left pulled out just so. The faint, alien scent of Julian's cologne lingered in my workshop, a place he never entered. They were searching, quietly, clumsily, looking for documents, passwords, keys to the kingdom. They thought they were being stealthy, but to me, their intrusions were as loud as a shouted warning. They were amateurs playing in a professional's arena, unaware that the arena itself was the trap. My brownstone is old, but I am not. Over the years, I had retrofitted it with my own particular security system, a network that was entirely analog. No Wi-Fi cameras to be hacked, no digital logs to be erased. It was a system of precisely placed mirrors, fiber optic filaments woven into the antique carpets that register pressure, and microphones no larger than a pinhead hidden in the plasterwork, all feeding into a secure, hardwired hub in my workshop subbasement. A place no one but I knew existed. I didn't need to watch them. I needed only to listen. And what I heard in the evenings, through the tiny, tinny speaker, was the sound of my daughter's soul being methodically dismantled. "He's stonewalling Amy." Julian's voice sharp and frustrated. "He's not as senile as he looks. We need to accelerate the timeline." "I don't know, Julian," Amelia's voice small and strained. "He seems fine to me most days. That's the insidious nature of these diseases. Moments of clarity. It's confusing for everyone. The doctor said we need to document every instance of forgetfulness, every slip-up. For the competency hearing. We're not doing this to him. We're doing this for him. To protect him." The word protect was a venomous perversion. They were protecting the assets from the owner. The final piece of their strategy arrived not through a microphone, but through the trash. I still handled the household recycling, a small, mundane chore I'd never relinquished. As I was separating the paper and plastic, I saw it tucked inside a crumpled cosmetics catalog, a small, empty cardboard box from a specialty online pharmacy. The prescription label had been torn off, but the drug's trade name was clearly visible: Chronicet. I didn't recognize the name. Back in my sub-basement, a few keystrokes on a firewalled, untraceable computer brought up the data. Chronicet was not a common drug. It was an experimental neuroleptic, a powerful antipsychotic with a very specific, very nasty set of side effects when administered to a healthy individual. Memory lapses, disorientation, slurred speech, emotional volatility. In short, it was a drug that could perfectly mimic the symptoms of rapid-onset dementia. A cold, methodical clarity settled over me. This was their endgame. The dinner at Aurelia wasn't going to be a one-time event. It was the beginning of a sustained chemical assault designed to break my mind, to turn me into the confused, incompetent old man they needed me to be. They would document my decline, bring in their paid-for doctor, and a sympathetic judge would have no choice but to grant them full conservatorship over me and everything I owned. It was an elegant, cruel, and nearly perfect plan. Nearly. They had made two fundamental errors. They had mistaken my quietness for weakness, and they had assumed the library was unguarded. That evening, the encrypted email from Marcus arrived. It contained a single, password-protected file. The password was the name of the street in Brussels where I had pulled his life out of the fire 2 decades ago. The file opened, and the story of Silken Vengeance spooled out onto my screen. It was not a biography. It was a charge sheet. The report from Marcus was not a document. It was an autopsy, a meticulous dissection of a life built on smoke and mirrors. Marcus hadn't just done a background check. He had peeled back every layer of Silken Vengeance's fabricated reality, and the truth underneath was rotten to the core. He wasn't a startup genius. He was a serial failure. 3 companies, all in the tech sector, all driven into the ground. Not through bad luck or market downturns, but through a consistent pattern of gross mismanagement, embezzlement, and fraud. He would dazzle investors with charisma and buzzwords, secure millions in seed funding, live lavishly on the corporate accounts, and then, just as the entire edifice was about to collapse, he would resign, leaving a crater of debt and a web of lawsuits in his wake. Marcus had included scanned copies of the legal filings, the furious emails from duped venture capitalists, the sworn affidavits from former employees. Julian hadn't built businesses. He had perfected the art of the high-tech grift. But that was the clean part of his story. The dirty part lay in the appendices. Silken Vengeance was drowning in debt, and not just the men in suits who settled things in court. He owed money to people who settled things in back alleys. A 7-figure sum to a Russian investor in Miami with documented ties to the Bratva. Another $500,000 to a loan shark operating out of Macau's VIP casino circuit. Marcus had even included satellite photos of Julian meeting with these men, his confident posture replaced by a deferential, almost fearful slump. His entire life was a performance, a desperate race against time. He wasn't courting Amelia for her love or even her money in the abstract sense. He was hunting her for a lifeline. He needed the Finch fortune not to get richer, but to stay alive. The legacy unlocked reality show, the public romance, the engagement, it was all a grand spectacle designed to buy him time, to project an image of stability to the predators who were circling him. I sat back in the worn leather of my chair, the glow of the monitor illuminating the grim set of my mouth. The report was a masterpiece of intelligence gathering. Financial forensics, human intelligence, digital surveillance. Marcus had left no stone unturned. The final page was a summary, a single damning paragraph. Subject JV is financially and reputationally insolvent. Current net worth is estimated at negative $8.7 million. Multiple creditors have set a hard deadline for repayment, coinciding with the end of the current quarter. Subject is considered highly motivated and demonstrates sociopathic tendencies with a history of exploiting personal relationships for financial gain. Threat level to client's assets, critical. Threat level to client's personal well-being, severe. I closed the file. The pieces didn't just fit. They locked together with the cold, satisfying click of a well-made mechanism. The pressure from his creditors explained the frantic timeline. The need to discredit me wasn't just about greed. It was about survival. He couldn't afford a lengthy, contested legal battle over the trust. He needed a swift, surgical coup. He needed me declared mentally incompetent, and he needed it yesterday. And my daughter, my Amelia, she was his tool, his key. I didn't know how much she knew about the debts and the loan sharks. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps he had sold her a different story, a fairy tale of temporary cash flow problems that her family's dormant capital could easily solve. He would have played on her insecurities, her desire to be a player in his glamorous world, her chafing frustration with her boring father who just didn't understand the new economy. He would have made her a co-conspirator in what she believed was a modern business maneuver, never letting her see the blood in the water. The thought of her, so desperate for a life she imagined she was missing that she would poison her own father, was a physical pain, a sharp stone in my chest. But the librarian had no room for pain. Pain was a liability. There was only the problem and the solution. The problem was Julian Vance. The solution would be to give him exactly what he wanted, a sick, declining old man. I stood up and walked from the sterile, digital world of the sub-basement back into the analog warmth of my workshop. I ran my hand over the spine of a 19th century medical text I was restoring, its pages filled with descriptions of ailments and their symptoms. I had spent a lifetime studying the works of others. Now, I would become the author of my own fiction. My performance would need to be flawless. It would have to be gradual, convincing not just to an amateur manipulator like Julian and a desperate girl like Amelia, but to the medical professional they would inevitably bring in. I would have to seed their narrative, water it with carefully orchestrated episodes, and let it bloom into the diagnosis they so desperately needed. I thought about the butter on the bread plate, the tiny, tasteless dose of truth that now coursed through Julian's veins. It was a beautiful little device, that compound. It didn't compel you to babble uncontrollably. It simply removed the filter between thought and speech. If you tried to tell a deliberate lie, your brain would short-circuit, forcing you to state the absolute, unvarnished truth instead. It was perfect for an interrogation, or, say, a live television interview. His fate was sealed. He just didn't know it yet. Now, it was time to begin sealing Amelia's. I couldn't save her from the consequences of her choices. No parent can. But I could ensure that when the bill came due, it would be presented to the right person. I went upstairs to the main library. I found Amelia on the phone, her back to me. "Everything is on track," she was saying, her voice low and conspiratorial. "The final episode is in 2 days. It's all going to be perfect." I stepped into her line of sight. She flinched, snapping the phone shut. "Daddy, I didn't see you there." "Just getting a book," I said, my voice deliberately a little vague, my eyes unfocused. I shuffled over to a shelf, running my hand along the spines as if I'd forgotten what I was looking for. Did you call the caterer for that party thing? Your mother always handled that." Concern, mixed with a flicker of triumph, washed over her face. "The gala, Daddy." "Yes, I handled everything. Don't you worry about a thing." Good. I murmured, pulling a random book from the shelf and staring at its cover blankly. "That's good. I feel a little tired. I think I'll go lie down." I turned and shuffled out of the room, deliberately brushing against the doorframe. As I walked down the hall, I could feel her eyes on my back, watching me. The first scene of my final act had just begun, and the audience was captivated. The morning after my feigned confusion in the library, the atmosphere in the house was thick with a cloying, artificial solicitude. It was like living inside a sympathy card. Amelia made me breakfast, something she hadn't done since she was a teenager. The eggs were slightly rubbery, the toast a shade too dark, but she presented it with the earnest flourish of a Florence Nightingale. "I thought you could use a good breakfast, Daddy," she said, her voice dripping with manufacturer concern. To keep your strength up. Julian, ever the supporting actor, appeared at her side, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. We're here for you, Arthur. Whatever you need. I looked at them, this perfectly staged tableau of loving care, and I felt a profound sense of detachment. It was like watching a play from the wings. I could see the actors, hear their lines, but I was acutely aware of the lighting rigs, the stagehands, and the pre-written script. Thank you, dear, I said to Amelia, my voice a little thin. I picked up my fork, then seemed to forget what I was doing with it, holding it suspended over the plate for a long moment before setting it down. I seemed to have lost my appetite. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the subtle exchange of glances between them. It was a look of confirmation. It's working. And so my performance began in earnest. It was a role I had been preparing for my entire life, though I hadn't known it. My work as a restorer had taught me the art of imitation. I could replicate the precise tooling on a 16th century Italian binding, mix pigments to perfectly match a faded medieval illustration, distress new leather, so it looked centuries old. Now I was applying those skills to myself. I was distressing my own mind. I created a symphony of symptoms, each note carefully chosen and perfectly timed. I would misplace my reading glasses only to have them turn up on my head. I'd call Amelia by her mother's name, Eleanor, and then correct myself with a look of pained confusion. Once, while Julian was pontificating about market trends, I interrupted him to ask what day it was, my expression one of genuine, unnerving bewilderment. Each instance was a small, perfectly placed stone, building a wall of evidence around them. Their job was made easy. All they had to do was observe and record. And I knew they were. The little red light of a hidden camera, no bigger than a screw head, suddenly appeared in the corner of a bookshelf in the living room. Another one sprouted in the hallway. They were building their case for the competency hearing, and I was their star witness. The most challenging part of the performance was not the active symptoms, but the quiet moments in between. The vacant stares into the middle distance. The slight, almost imperceptible tremor in my hand as I reached for a teacup. The moments where I would be reading a book and would have to turn back a page, as if I'd lost my place, a look of faint frustration on my face. These were the details that would sell the lie, that would lend it the texture of reality. The librarian had taught me that the most effective deceptions are 90% truth. I didn't have to feign my sorrow over my wife's death, or my deep, abiding love for the daughter I was losing. I just had to channel those genuine emotions, refract them through the prism of my feigned illness. The grief became disorientation. The love became a clinging, pathetic dependence. The cameras drank it all in. Their doctor arrived 2 days after the dinner. A man named Alistair Finch. No relation, a cruel irony, with a soft voice, a kind face, and the dead, empty eyes of a man whose morals had long been for sale. He had been well briefed. He sat with me in the library, asking me gentle, condescending questions. Who is the current president, Arthur? Can you count backward from 100 by sevens? What did you have for breakfast this morning? I play my part. I stumbled on the math. I claimed to have had oatmeal for breakfast, not eggs. When he asked who the president was, I looked at him with a flash of my old fire. Don't be ridiculous, I snapped. It's Reagan. Then, I let my face fall into a mask of utter confusion. Isn't it? Dr. Finch patted my hand. It's okay, Arthur. We're just having a chat. He looked over at Amelia and Julian, who stood in the doorway, the very picture of worried children. He gave them a slow, somber nod. The diagnosis is confirmed. Later, I heard their conversation through my listening devices. Rapid onset Alzheimer's, most likely with a vascular component, Dr. Finch said, his voice a clinical drone. Given the speed of the deterioration, we need to move quickly on the conservatorship. For his own protection, I'll start the paperwork immediately. The court will expedite it given the clear and present evidence of his cognitive decline, which you've wisely been documenting. Thank you, Doctor, Julian said, his voice slick with false gratitude. We just want what's best for him. Of course you do, Finch replied. The faint sound of an envelope being passed from one hand to another was the last thing I heard before the transmission ended. That night, the house was quiet. They believed they were on the cusp of total victory. They thought the old man was safely tucked in his bed, his mind dissolving into a fog of forgetting. But the old man was not in his bed. The old man was in the sub-basement, bathed in the cool blue light of 3 monitors. The performance was over for the day. The librarian was back at work. On one screen was a live feed of Julian's laptop camera, which Marcus's team had hacked. On another, a complex flowchart mapping out the web of shell corporations he used to hide his money. And on the third, the central screen, was the final piece of my own plan. It was the guest list for the Finch Foundation Gala, the grand finale of their reality show. The event where they would publicly announce my tragic decline and their heroic ascension. Using Marcus's access, I was making a few small additions to that list. The SEC's Regional Director of Enforcement, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist from the Boston Globe who specialized in financial crimes, and a quiet, unassuming man from Miami who was the chief enforcer for the Bratviz U.S. operations, a man to whom Julian Vance owed a very large, very overdue amount of money. They had built a beautiful stage for their drama. It seemed a shame not to invite a few more critics to the premiere. I looked at the clock. 36 hours until showtime. I was going to let them have their perfect moment, their triumph. I was going to let them stand on that stage, under the bright, warm lights, and feel the thrill of absolute victory. Because despair is never so potent as when it follows a moment of pure, unadulterated hope. I wasn't just going to defeat them. I was going to hollow them out, leave them as empty shells for the entire world to see. It was, I thought with a flicker of cold satisfaction, the loving thing to do. The legal documents arrived the next day by courier. Thick, cream-colored envelopes with the embossed letterhead of a high-priced law firm. Julian laid them on the polished surface of my mahogany dining table with an air of solemn finality, as if he were presenting a eulogy. "Just some papers from the lawyer, Arthur," he said, his voice a gentle, patronizing caress. "Standard procedure. Dr. Finch recommended we get your estate in order just to make things easier down the line." Amelia stood beside him, her face a carefully composed mask of sorrow. She placed a pen in my hand. "It's for the best, Daddy. It gives us the ability to pay your bills, to manage the household, to take care of you." I looked down at the signature line on the petition for conservatorship. My own name, typed neatly, waiting for my signature to condemn it. To sign this document was to voluntarily place the keys to my own cage into my jailer's hands. According to the laws of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, once signed and ratified by a judge, this paper would render me a non-person. Powerless. Voiceless. My hand trembled as I signed, a perfect imitation of age and infirmity. Each loop and swirl of my name was a nail in their coffin, and they were handing me the hammer. They saw a capitulation. I saw a contract, and I was about to enforce the fine print with extreme prejudice. With the signing of those papers, the final transformation of my home was complete. It was no longer a sanctuary. It became a house of glass. The reality show's film crew, once relegated to specific times and rooms, now seemed to be a permanent fixture. They moved through the halls with a proprietary quietness, their cameras capturing every staged moment of my decline. My fumbling attempts to butter toast, my vacant stare out the window, my daughter patiently reading to me from a book I myself had written under a pseudonym years ago. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. Julian, emboldened by his legal victory, shed the last vestiges of his guest status. He began taking calls in my study, his feet propped up on my desk, his voice full of the false bravado of a man who believes he has already won. He started referring to the brownstone as our place when talking to Amelia. He even had the audacity to bring in an appraiser one afternoon, a slick man in a cheap suit, to assess the value of my book collection. I watched them from my armchair, a shawl draped over my knees, my face a blank slate. I watched as the appraiser ran his greasy fingers over a 16th century vellum manuscript, and I did nothing. I listened as Julian discussed liquidating these dust catchers to fund his next-gen tech venture, and I said nothing. The rage inside me was a white-hot, silent furnace. But the librarian knew that premature action was the seed of all failure. Patience was the sharpest blade in his arsenal. My daughter, for her part, seemed to be living in a state of bifurcated reality. With me, she was the dutiful, long-suffering caregiver. Her voice was always soft, her touch gentle. She would help me with my tie, cut my food into smaller pieces, and remind me to take the vitamins Dr. Finch had prescribed, placebo sugar pills I'd swap for the real medication the first night. But when she was with Julian, away from me, or so she thought, her voice was brittle, her laughter strained. She was a ghost in her own home, haunted by a choice she could never undo. I saw her one evening, standing before a portrait of her mother, her hand resting on the gilded frame. Her shoulders were shaking. She wasn't crying tears of guilt. She was crying tears of fear. She had chained herself to a predator, and she was just beginning to realize the cage had bars for two. That night, alone in my workshop, the weight of it all pressed down on me. The performance, the deception, the imminent destruction. I picked up a small, silver-framed photograph from my workbench. It was of Eleanor and a 5-year-old Amelia, taken in the public garden. Amelia was on her mother's shoulders, laughing, her face a sunburst of pure, uncomplicated joy. This was the girl I was about to ruin. Not to save my money. The money was just paper. It was never about the money. It was about the violation. They hadn't just tried to rob me. They had tried to steal my mind, my identity, my very self. They had tried to unwrite my story and scribble their own cheap, ugly version over the top. It was an act of desecration, and the librarian did not suffer desecration. My jaw tightened. I put the photograph back in its place, my resolve hardening from a cold certainty into an unbreakable law of nature. I had given my daughter a world of beauty and order. She had chosen to invite chaos and ugliness into it. I could not save her from that choice. I could only teach her, and the world, that every choice has a consequence. I descended into the sub-basement. A new email from Marcus was waiting. Subject: guest list confirmation. The message was brief. All invitations accepted. Our friend from Miami is particularly eager to congratulate Mr. Vance on his new fundraising venture. He is bringing associates. Also, attached is the final piece you requested, the audio file from Vance's car. I clicked the attachment. A sound file began to play. It was a recording from a Bub Marcus's team had planted in Julian's car 2 days prior. It was Julian speaking to one of his creditors. His voice was no longer the smooth, confident purr he used in my house. It was the desperate, pleading whine of a cornered animal. Just a couple more days, Julian was saying. The old man is out of the picture. The assets will be liquid by the end of the week. You'll get your money, Ivan. All of it, plus the vig. Just give me until after the gala. There was a low, gravelly laugh on the other end of the line. The gala, the voice, thick with a Russian accent, repeated mockingly. You play with your television cameras, little man. But my clock is ticking louder than yours. You have until the party is over, Julian. Then my associates will collect, with or without the money. The line went dead. I closed the file. It was perfect. Julian wasn't just walking into a trap. He was walking onto a stage where every single person in the audience, from the SEC to the press to the mob, had a vested interest in watching him burn. They weren't just throwing a party. They were building their own guillotine. And I was going to be the one to release the blade. Night fell on the house of glass. The film crew packed up their equipment, leaving behind an unnerving silence. Julian and Amelia, flush with their success and exhausted by their performance, retired early. They were dreaming, I imagined, of stock portfolios and magazine covers. They slept the sound, untroubled sleep of the triumphant. They did not know about the ghosts. While the house above was still, the sub-basement hummed with silent, furious activity. This was my true workshop, a place not of restoration, but of meticulous, controlled demolition. The cool blue light of the monitors cast my face in stark, geometric shadows. I was no longer the frail old man in the shawl. I was the librarian, and the library was open for business. On one screen, I had a direct, encrypted line to Marcus. He wasn't just my intel source. He was my remote hands, my digital ghost in the machine. The triggers are set. Arthur, His voice came through the speakers crisp and devoid of emotion. The margin call on Vance's leveraged accounts is timed for 9:30 p.m. tomorrow, right in the middle of his speech. The Cayman Islands Financial Authority received an anonymous and very detailed tip about his largest shell corporation an hour ago. They'll freeze the account by morning. Good, I said, my eyes scanning a different screen that displayed a complex network diagram. The journalist from the Globe? Is she confirmed? Front row, center table. Her editor cleared her schedule for the night. She thinks she's covering a charity gala. She has no idea she's about to get the biggest story of her career. And our friend from Miami? He and his two nephews will be at a table by the service exit. As requested, they understand they are there to observe only, until the proceedings are concluded. I nodded, though he couldn't see me. Every piece was in place. The financial trap, the legal trap, the media trap, and finally, the physical one. Julian Vance was a dead man walking. He was just the only person in the city who didn't know it yet. My final task was the most delicate. I was crafting the presentation that would play on the huge screens behind the stage at the gala. They had given me the files themselves, a nauseatingly sentimental slideshow of family photos set to saccharine orchestral music. It took Marcus's team less than 5 minutes to gain access to the event's AV control system. I deleted their file. In its place, I began to build my own narrative. It was a work of brutalist art. I started with a clean, corporate-style graphic of Julian's network of shell companies, lines of debt connecting them like a spider's web. I added the names and headshots of his investors, the legitimate ones he defrauded and the not-so-legitimate ones who were now hunting him. I transcribed the most damning parts of his phone calls, the text appearing on screen in a stark, sans-serif font. The final slide was the simplest, a high-resolution scan of the empty chronoset box from the recycling bin, with a medical definition of its effects on a healthy human brain listed below. I didn't add any music. The silence would be more powerful. When I was finished, I sat back. It was a digital ledger of one man's ruin. Cold, factual, and irrefutable. I saved the file under the name Finch_Final.mp4 and uploaded it to the Gala server. The trap was now fully baited and set. The work was done. The ghosts could rest. I shut down the monitors, and the sub-basement was plunged into darkness. I ascended the hidden stairs, back into the sleeping house. The air upstairs felt thick, heavy with unspoken things. I walked down the hall, my footsteps silent on the old Persian runners. I paused at Amelia's door. It was slightly ajar. I pushed it open a fraction of an inch more. The moonlight streamed through her window, illuminating her face as she slept. In sleep, she looked younger, the hard lines of ambition and anxiety erased. She looked like the little girl who used to fall asleep in my lap while I read to her, her breath warm against my chest. A wave of grief, so powerful it almost buckled my knees, washed over me. This was my masterpiece of destruction, and she was standing at its epicenter. I was about to save my name, my legacy, and my fortune. But in the process, I was going to utterly annihilate my own daughter's life. Her name would be a synonym for patricide, her face a meme for greed and betrayal. No door would ever open for her again. Was this justice? Or was it just a more sophisticated, more devastating form of violence? I looked at her peaceful face, and for a moment, I considered stopping it all. I could erase the file, call off Marcus, let them have the money. I could disappear, live out my days in quiet anonymity. Let them have their tainted victory. Then I remembered the feeling of that first drop of poison wine on my tongue, the look of triumph in Julian's eyes, the sound of my daughter's voice, small and strained, as she agreed to a plan to chemically lobotomize her own father. This wasn't about the money. This was about a fundamental violation. A line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. They hadn't just come from my house. They had come from my mind. And in the librarian's world, that was the one unforgivable sin. I pulled the door gently shut, leaving her to her last peaceful dreams. I walked to my own room, the suit I planned to where it was laid out on the bed. A simple, dark, perfectly tailored suit. The kind of suit a man wears to a funeral. I did not sleep. I sat in a chair by the window, watching the sky over Boston slowly lighten from indigo to a bruised purple, then to a soft, hopeful gray. The sun was rising. The day of the reckoning had come. I was ready to play my final part. The day of the gala was a blur of calculated chaos. The house was swarmed. The reality show crew, their excitement palpable, captured every detail. Amelia, a vision in a silver gown that shimmered under the lights, directed florists and caterers with a feverish intensity. She was a general marshaling her troops for a final, glorious victory. Julian floated through it all, a conquering hero before the battle, shaking hands, clapping backs, his smile a flash of brilliant, predatory white. They treated me like a precious, fragile prop. Amelia helped me dress, her hands fumbling slightly with the buttons on my shirt. "You'll be on the stage with us, Daddy," she said, her voice a little too bright. "Just for a little while. We want everyone to see how much we love you." "That's nice, dear," I murmured, allowing my gaze to drift vaguely towards the window. Julian wheeled in a handsome, high-end wheelchair. It wasn't a cheap, hospital-issue model. It was sleek and black, more like a throne than a medical device. "Just to make sure you're comfortable, Arthur," he said. "It's a long night." The unspoken message was clear. You will be seen, but you will be silent. You will be present, but you will be powerless. I allowed them to settle me into it, arranging a cashmere blanket over my legs. I sank into the role of the invalid patriarch, my head lolling slightly to one side, my hands resting limply in my lap. I was an object, a symbol of their compassion, and they were so caught up in their own narrative that they failed to see the glint of steel beneath the facade of frailty. The ride to the venue, a grand ballroom in a historic downtown hotel, was surreal. We traveled in a black Escalade, cameras mounted on the dashboard, capturing our somber family procession. Julian drove. Amelia sat in the back with me, holding my hand. Her hand was cold as ice. "Are you nervous, Daddy?" she asked. I looked at her, really looked at her, for what felt like the first time in months. I saw the fine lines of stress around her eyes, the desperate, hollow look behind the practiced smile. She was terrified, not of getting caught, but of not getting away with it. "No, Eleanor," I said, deliberately using her mother's name again. "I'm not nervous. It's just a party." She flinched, but Julian shot her a look in the rearview mirror. A look that said, "Perfect. The cameras got it." The gala was a masterpiece of ostentatious charity. An orchestra played softly. Ice sculptures melted under warm lights. Boston's elite, the old money and the new, mingled, their laughter tinkling like the champagne in their glasses. They were all here to witness the public coronation of the city's newest power couple. I saw them all as we were wheeled through the crowd. I saw the journalist from the Globe, her reporter's notebook already open, her eyes sharp and assessing. I saw the SEC director looking bored and out of place. And in a shadowed alcove near the back, I saw the man from Miami. He wasn't looking at the stage. He was looking at Julian, his expression as flat and cold as a tombstone. They placed my wheelchair at the side of the stage, a position of honor that was in reality a gilded cage. I had a perfect view of the adoring crowd and of the two massive screens that flanked the podium. They were currently displaying a looping video of the Finch Foundation logo. Soon, they would display my work. The show began. The host of Legacy Unlocked, a man with impossibly white teeth and a voice like warm syrup, took the stage. He spoke of family, of legacy, of the difficult but noble choices that children must sometimes make for their aging parents. He was setting the stage for the grand reveal. Then, he introduced them. "Please welcome the couple whose love and devotion are an inspiration to us all, Julian Vance and Amelia Finch." They walked onto the stage to a thunderous ovation. They stood at the podium, holding hands, bathed in the spotlight. They were radiant. They were triumphant. They had reached the summit. Julian stepped to the microphone. "Thank you," he began, his voice thick with emotion he did not feel. "Tonight is not about us. It's about honoring a great man. My future father-in-law, Arthur Finch." He gestured to me. A spotlight hit me, and I blinked owlishly, playing my part. It's about carrying his legacy of integrity and wisdom into the future, he continued, his voice soaring with false sincerity. The audience was rapt. They were buying every word. My family, you see, Julian said, leaning into the mic, sharing a deep, personal secret with 1,000 of his closest friends, is no stranger to the cruel whims of fate. My own father. He was about to launch into a well-rehearsed and completely fictional story about his father's struggle with a similar illness. It was the emotional centerpiece of his speech, the part designed to elicit tears and open checkbooks. This was the moment. From my pocket, I took out a small, simple device. It looked like a garage door opener. It had one button. It was a custom-made remote trigger, synced to the AV system and keyed to my biometrics. No one else could use it. Marcus had called it the conductor's baton. I pressed the button. On the massive screens behind Julian, the Finch Foundation logo vanished. For a second, the screens were black. Julian faltered, confused by the technical glitch. The audience murmured. And then, the first slide of my presentation appeared. It was the diagram of his shell corporations. Silent. Stock. Brutal. The murmur in the crowd grew louder. Julian turned, his back to the audience, and stared at the screen. The color drained from his face. His perfect smile dissolved into a mask of slack-jawed horror. He looked at the AV booth at the back of the room, his expression furious. But the technicians there were just as confused as he was. They hadn't touched anything. He turned back to the microphone, his mind scrambling. A slight technical difficulty, it seems. I pressed the button again. The next slide appeared. A high-resolution photo of Julian meeting with a Russian mobster in Miami. The date and time were stamped in the corner. From the back of the room, I saw the man from Miami lean forward, a flicker of interest in his dead eyes. Panic began to set in on Julian's face. He looked at Amelia. She was staring at the screen, her face a kabuki mask of utter disbelief. This was not in the script. Ladies and gentlemen, Julian stammered, trying to regain control. I pressed the button a third time. Now the screen showed the audio file from his car, transcribed in huge white letters against the black background. The old man is out of the picture. The assets will be liquid by the end of the week. You'll get your money, Ivan. A collective gasp went through the ballroom. The journalist from the Globe was scribbling furiously in her notepad. The SEC director was no longer bored. He was on his phone. Julian was imploding. The truth serum, the chronicet-laced butter he'd ingested 48 hours ago, had reached its peak efficacy. He was now physiologically incapable of lying. He opened his mouth to deny it, to spin some tale, but his own brain betrayed him. It's all true, he blurted into the microphone, his voice a strangled cry. The words seemed to surprise him as much as anyone. I owe them millions. I needed the money. I had to get him out of the way. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a vacuum. Amelia looked from the screen to Julian and then, finally, to me. Our eyes met across the stage. In my eyes, she didn't see a confused, sick old man. She saw the librarian. She saw the man who had always been there, watching, listening, waiting. She saw the architect of this entire, perfect, hellish moment. And in that instant, she understood everything. I gave her a slow, almost imperceptible nod. A final, silent acknowledgement. You made your choice. I pressed the button one last time. The final image filled the screens. The empty box of chronicet. And with that, I knew my own performance was over. It was time for the curtain to fall. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a physical presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from 1,000 threads of shock, horror, and dawning comprehension. The image of the chronicet box glowed on the screens, an icon of unimaginable betrayal, burning itself onto the retinas of everyone in the room. On stage, Julian Vance was a man undone. The truth serum had stripped him of his defenses, leaving his raw, pathetic ambition exposed to the world. He stared at the microphone as if it were a venomous snake. He had confessed. He had confessed on live television, at his own coronation, and he couldn't even understand how he'd done it. Amelia was a statue carved from ice. She stood frozen, her hands still linked with his, a a forgotten anchor to a sinking ship. Her gaze was locked on me, her hazel eyes, her mother's eyes, wide with a terror that went beyond the loss of money or reputation. It was the terror of a child who has just realized that the monster they were warned about was not only real, but had been living with them all along, patiently waiting in the dark. And in that moment of absolute silence, I moved. There was no struggle, no theatrical groan of effort. I simply placed my hands on the arms of the wheelchair and stood up. My back, which had been stooped in a convincing curve of senility, straightened. My shoulders, which had been slumped in defeat, squared. I took the cashmere blanket from my lap, folded it once with neat, precise movements, and placed it on the seat of the now empty wheelchair. The act was mundane, methodical, and in that context, it was the most shocking thing anyone had ever seen. A wave of sound rippled through the ballroom, 1,000 people inhaling at once. I took a step forward, my movements fluid and sure. The frail, shuffling invalid was gone. In his place stood a man they did not know. I walked to the center stage podium, the spotlights following me. Julian stumbled back, away from me, his face a mask of primal fear. Amelia did not move. She couldn't. I adjusted the microphone, the small sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. I looked out at the sea of stunned faces, the blinking red lights of the cameras, the hungry eyes of the journalist on the front row. I felt no stage fright, no anxiety. I felt nothing but a cold, final clarity. Legacy, I said, and my voice, no longer the reedy, uncertain whisper of a sick old man, rang out through the ballroom speakers, clear and hard as forged steel. Legacy is not what you inherit. It is what you earn. It is not a prize to be stolen, but a responsibility to be honored. I turned my head slightly and looked at Julian. He was trembling, sweat beading on his forehead, his Tom Ford suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume. You, sir, I said, my voice dropping, becoming conversational, intimate, and all the more menacing for it, are a debtor. You have borrowed against lives you did not own and futures you had no right to touch. Tonight, your credit has expired. Your account is closed. Then I turned my eyes to my daughter, to Amelia. Her face was streaked with silent tears, her perfect makeup ruined. The silver dress that had looked so triumphant now looked like a shroud. I said nothing to her. I offered no explanation, no comfort, no final condemnation. My silence was her sentence. In that moment, she ceased to be my daughter. She became just another name in a closed ledger. A debt paid in full. That was when the silence broke and the world rushed back in. Two men in dark suits, their movements sharp and economical, were suddenly on stage. They flanked Julian, their FBI credentials held up for the cameras to see. Julian Vance, one of them said, his voice flat and official, "You're under arrest for wire fraud, conspiracy, and..." The rest was lost in the eruption of noise. The flash of 100 cameras going off at once was like a strobe light. The journalist was on her feet, shouting questions. The crowd surged forward, a wave of morbid curiosity, their phones held high to capture the fall. Julian didn't resist. He seemed to shrink, all the air going out of him. As they clicked the handcuffs on his wrists, his Patek Philippe watch glinted under the lights, a final, pathetic symbol of a life that had never been real. I saw the men from Miami moving from the back of the room, not towards the stage, but towards the exits. Their work here was done. The debt would be collected by the federal government now, a much more efficient, if less painful process. I turned my back on the chaos. I had seen enough. My work was finished. I walked to the edge of the stage, ignoring the shouted questions, the pointing fingers, the blinding lights. I walked past my daughter, who stood alone now in the center of the storm, a shipwrecked survivor on a barren island of her own making. I did not look at her. I descended the side stairs with a steady, unhurried gait and walked through the stunned, parting crowd. They stared at me as if I were an apparition. The old man who wasn't old. The victim who was the victor. The ghost who had come back to haunt his own funeral. I reached the grand doors of the ballroom and pushed them open. The sounds of the pandemonium faded behind me, replaced by the cool, quiet hush of the hotel lobby. There was no triumph in my heart. No elation. Only the quiet, humming satisfaction of a complex machine that has performed its function perfectly and is now powering down. The books were balanced. The story was told. The library was closing. The walk home was 3 miles. I didn't take a cab. I needed the cold Boston night air, the familiar weight of the city's old stones beneath my feet. I walked through the public garden, past the darkened swan boats bobbing gently on the lagoon, and into the gaslit labyrinth of Beacon Hill. The city was the same, but my world had been irrevocably altered. A bridge had not just been burned. It had been vaporized, its ashes scattered on the wind. When I reached the brownstone, the house was silent. The circus had moved on, chasing the flashing lights of the police cars and the promise of a juicier story. A single, forgotten paper cup from the caterers lay on its side on the front steps, a sad piece of confetti after a disastrous party. I let myself in. The air inside was stale with a lingering sense of perfume and panic. I walked through the downstairs rooms, the settings of my recent performance. The library where I had feigned my first major lapse. The dining room where I had signed away my rights. The armchair where I had sat, a docile prop in their drama. It all felt like a set from a play that had finished its run. Unreal. Untouchable. I went to my study and poured myself a scotch. The same single malt Julian had so casually helped himself to. The amber liquid was cool in the heavy crystal glass. I took a sip. It didn't taste of victory. It tasted of smoke and dust, the flavor of endings. I didn't have to turn on the news. I knew what was happening. The story of the Finch Gala would be a supernova, a media explosion of unimaginable magnitude. The tale had everything: old money, new tech, a beautiful heiress, a charming sociopath, and a stunning, televised reversal of fortune. It was a morality play for the digital age, and it would be dissected and debated for weeks. Julian Vance would become a byword for hubris. Amelia Finch, a cautionary tale of greed. And me? I would become a legend, a folk hero, the quiet old man who outsmarted the wolves. People would project their own narratives onto me, see in me what they wanted to see: a brilliant strategist, a righteous avenger, a devoted father protecting his legacy. They would all be wrong. I was none of those things. I was just a man who understood the mechanics of ruin. I had not acted out of righteousness. My motives were colder, purer than that. I had acted to restore order. The natural order of my own life had been violated, and I had, with clinical precision, reset it. The cost of that reset was still being calculated. I finished my drink and went down to the sub-basement for the last time. The monitors were black, their work done. I systematically began the process of erasure. Encrypted files were triple deleted. Communication lines to Marcus were permanently severed. The hard drives were subjected to a powerful electromagnetic pulse, wiping them clean of any trace of the librarian and his ghosts. Within an hour, it was as if the command center had never existed. It was just a cold, concrete room beneath a quiet house. My final act was to call Marcus. He picked up on the first ring. "Arthur," he said. There was a new note in his voice. "Oh, the books are closed, Marcus," I said. "The library is permanently shut." "Understand," he said. "It was a masterpiece, Arthur. I've never seen anything like it." "It was a pest control issue," I reply, my voice flat. "Nothing more. The debt between us is settled." "There was never a debt, Arthur. Only loyalty." "Goodbye, Marcus," I said, and ended the call before he could reply. I removed the burner phone's battery, snapped the SIM card in half, and dropped the pieces into a beaker of acid. The last thread was cut. Arthur Finch, the book restorer, was once again alone. I didn't expect to hear from her. Not that night. But as I was ascending the stairs from my workshop, my phone, my real phone, buzzed in my pocket. Her name flashed on the screen. Amelia. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I answered. I said nothing. "Daddy." Her voice was a shard of glass. Broken. Raw. Unrecognizable. She wasn't calling from a quiet room. I could hear the sounds of the city in the background. Sirens, traffic, the disembodied voice of a news anchor coming from a television in a nearby storefront. "Why?" she whispered. The word was not an accusation. It was a genuine, desperate plea for understanding. I thought for a long time, looking at the portrait of her mother that hung in the hallway. Eleanor's smile was kind, but her eyes were knowing. She had always known what I was capable of. And he made a critical error in your calculations, I said finally, my voice as calm and steady as a surgeon's hand. You saw an old man, and you mistook his silence for weakness. You assessed the value of my assets, but you failed to assess the value of my character. She started, then broke down into a racking sob. I never wanted to hurt you. He told me it was the only way. It doesn't matter what he said, Amelia. I interrupted, my voice devoid of pity. It only matters what you did. You held the bottle. You poured the wine. That is the only truth that remains. Every action has a consequence. Every choice leaves a mark, like a tooling iron on leather. Some marks can be polished away. Others are permanent. You have made a permanent mark. A long silence stretched between us, filled only by her ragged breathing. What do I do now? She asked, her voice the small, lost sound of a child. I looked again at her mother's portrait. I had made a promise to Eleanor on her deathbed. I had promised to protect our daughter. For 20 years, I had interpreted that promise in one way, to give her a world of safety and comfort. Tonight, I realized I had been wrong. Protection wasn't about building soft walls. It was about teaching hard lessons. It was about letting the fire burn you, so you learn to respect the flame. You begin by taking responsibility for the story you have written, I said. This is your book now. You must write the ending yourself. I ended the call. I did not block her number. I simply set the phone down on the hall table and walked away. The house was finally truly quiet. The ghosts were gone. The performance was over. All that was left was an old man in a silent house, surrounded by the stories of other people's lives, and the piercing, unbearable knowledge that in order to save his own story, he had been forced to burn the one chapter he had loved most. Epilogue. 6 months later, the dust had settled, leaving behind a new, stark landscape. Julian Vance took a plea deal. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable evidence and the looming threat of his less-than-legal creditors, he pled guilty to fraud and conspiracy. The judge, citing the unusually cruel and predatory nature of his crimes, sentenced him to the maximum term, 20 years in a federal penitentiary. His name and face became a permanent fixture in the annals of spectacular corporate flameouts. Amelia was not charged. The U.S. Attorney's Office, in a move I suspected was influenced by a quiet, anonymous word from someone like Marcus, declared her a victim of manipulation, a pawn in Julian's larger game. Legally, she was free, but her real sentence was being served outside the courtroom. Her name was toxic. Her face was infamous. She lost everything: her social standing, her friends, her future. The reality show aired a special report on the scandal that shattered all its previous ratings records, cementing her humiliation as a permanent part of the cultural lexicon. She disappeared from public life, erased by the very fame she had so desperately craved. She wrote me letters. Long, rambling, tear-stained letters, sent from a small apartment in a city I did not recognize. I read the first one. I saw the shame, the remorse, the desperate search for a path back to the life she had lost. I saw that she was beginning to understand. I did not read the others. They sat in an unopened pile on the corner of my desk. Her story was hers to write now. I could no longer be her editor. My own life returned to its familiar, quiet rhythm. The world knew me as the Beacon Hill Bulldog or the Silent Lion, but in my own neighborhood, I was just Arthur Finch, the book restorer. The requests for interviews and book deals eventually faded, and I was left in peace. I sit now in my workshop. The morning sun, the same sun that rose on the day of the reckoning, streams through the window. In my hands is a medieval manuscript, a 13th century copy of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. Its spine is broken, its pages water-stained. It is a thing of beauty that has been grievously wounded. My work is to heal it, to mend the tears, to reinforce the binding, to make it whole again. It is slow, painstaking work. It requires patience, precision, and a deep, abiding respect for the story held within. On my desk, beside my tools, sits the small, silver-framed photograph of Eleanor and a 5-year-old Amelia in the public garden. My daughter is laughing, her face a sunburst of pure joy. I look at her face, and I feel the vast, echoing silence of my house. I won. I protected my legacy. I balanced the books. I restored order. But there are some things that, once broken, can never be fully restored. There will always be a scar, a faint line in the paper, visible only to the expert eye, that whispers of the damage that was done. My victory was absolute, and my punishment is to live with it. Every book has an ending. Some are just not meant to be happy.